Welcome to The Explainer. So we're traveling back in time today, right into the heart of the years between 320 and 550 CE. It's an era just absolutely bursting with so much advancement, so much creativity, that historians literally call it the golden age of ancient India. We are, of course, talking about the magnificent Gupta Empire.
Okay, let's dive into this. To see if this era truly lives up to that legendary title, we're going to run through 5 key areas today. Defining the Golden Age, the great Gupta rulers, a scientific and cultural peak, the complex social reality, and then finally, the decline of the empire.
Section 1. Defining the Golden Age. Political stability, economic prosperity, and classical civilization. Setting the stage here. After the older Kushana and Satavahana empires faded out, the Guptas stepped right into the power vacuum in the Magadha region, initially led by their founder Sri Gupta and his successor Ghatotkacha.
Moving right along to Section 2, the great Gupta rulers, architects of the empire. Now we're transitioning from those early founders to the true, heavy-hitting imperial conquerors.
Just to give you a clear temporal anchor, we're looking at a timeline from 319 CE with Chandragupta I all the way down to Skandagupta in 455 CE. You know, it is incredibly rare in history to see over a century of continuous, highly effective leadership like this. But this unbroken chain of brilliant rulers is exactly the engine that drove the Gupta Empire to its absolute peak.
The real game changer here, though, was Chandragupta I. He's widely considered the true founder of the empire. And a massive part of that success came down to a highly strategic marriage alliance with Kumaradevi, who was from the incredibly powerful Lichavi clan. This boosted his political influence so much that he adopted the title Maharaja Dhiraja, which translates to King of Kings. Talk about a power move, right? It was pure projection of ego, and it officially kicked off the Gupta era in 319 CE.
And then along comes his son, Samudragupta. Historian V.A. Smith famously dubbed him the Napoleon of India. And honestly, for good reason. Thanks to the Allahabad pillar inscription, written by his court poet Harisena, we know Samudragupta launched these massive military campaigns. I mean, he directly annexed northern territories and forced southern kings to pay him tribute. And to really cement this total dominance, he performed the Ashwamedha. That's a grand, highly complex horse sacrifice ritual reserved only for an absolute supreme ruler.
Let's move to and see how this builds, because this momentum just kept growing under his son, Chandragupta II. He wasn't just a military genius who defeated the Shakas to secure some seriously lucrative Western trade routes, he was an administrative mastermind. All that new wealth funded his court of Navaratnas, or 9 gems. Think of him kind of like an ancient superhero team of intellectuals, including the legendary poet Kalidasa. We even have the fascinating diary of a Chinese traveler named Foxiang, who documented this incredibly peaceful, prosperous society. And later on, rulers like Kumaragupta and Skandagupta fiercely held the line, maintaining that stability against early invasions by the Hunas.
Section 3. A scientific and cultural peak, the classical age of Indian art and thought. This is where we shift gears from pure military might to absolute intellectual brilliance.
Because the borders were secure and trade routes were just overflowing with wealth, the empire could really afford to fund the mind. And wow, did they ever! This era produced a staggering roster of genius. It was the golden period of Sanskrit literature and foundational science. You've got Kalidasa penning these epic dramas, Shushruta and Charaka writing foundational texts on medicine and advanced surgery, and Vishakhadatta completely reshaping the literary landscape.
But we really need to pause on Aryapada and the mathematicians of this era. They developed the decimal notation and the very concept of zero. On top of that, Aryapada figured out that the Earth rotates on its axis and scientifically explains solar and lunar eclipses. Why this matters is just staggering. These specific concepts from the Gupta period literally laid the mathematical foundation for the modern, globalized world we live in today.
And this brilliantly illustrates how all that wealth was heavily invested right back into culture. The Guptas patronized incredible structural stone temples with square sanctums, like the Dashavatara temple. Art flourished, giving us these breathtaking Buddha statues and the magnificent Ajanta caves. Their metallurgy was just astonishingly advanced, too. I mean, the Iron Pillar of Delhi still resists rust today. They fostered massive education hubs like Nalanda University. And religiously, it was a dynamic, tolerant time. They patronized Brahmanism, Vaishnavism, and Shaivism, while allowing Buddhism and early Bhakti devotional movements to just thrive side by side.
Section 4. The complex social reality, looking beyond the gold.
Now, we need to take a vital, impartial pivot here to audit the everyday realities of this empire. The art and science of the era are undeniably spectacular, for sure. But, history is rarely perfect. When we look past those golden achievements to the reality on the ground, we have to ask ourselves a pretty difficult question. Was it a golden age for everyone?
The historical sources show us a society that was actually becoming increasingly stratified. The Varna system became far more rigid, and the position of Brahmins was greatly strengthened, mostly through royal land grants. On top of that, the position of women saw a notable decline compared to earlier eras. We see an increase in child marriage, the emergence of references to sati, and a definite decrease in women's education. And as was the case in many ancient empires, various forms of servitude and slavery were woven right into the social fabric.
Economically, we also have to consider the very real burden on the average ancient citizen. 1/4 to 1/6, that number represents the fraction of agricultural produce that the states collected as land revenue. So for the everyday farmer, this was a highly tangible, heavy economic burden that was ultimately funding those magnificent golden achievements.
Now, to manage all this taxation and this sprawling territory, the administration was actually surprisingly decentralized. The empire was divided into provinces called buktis, governed by uparikas. Those were then broken down into districts called vishayas. Down at the local level, the gramika, or village head, had some real autonomy. Even trade was largely managed by shrenis. These were local guilds that essentially functioned as independent production hubs, banks, and regulators.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the contrast. If we look back at the older Mauryan Empire, they controlled absolutely everything strictly from the center, using massive spy networks. The Guptas, they were kind of the exact opposite. They relied heavily on a decentralized system, handing out extensive land grants to local officials. While this spurred local economic growth at first, giving away that much local power ultimately planted the seeds of feudalism that would eventually tear the entire empire apart.
Section 5. Decline of the Empire. The Fall of the Guptas. So how exactly does an empire this mighty and this culturally rich finally crumble? Well, it was essentially a cascading failure. First off, brutal invasions by the Hunas severely damaged the empire's economy and administration. Then, following Skandagupta, that long line of brilliant rulers we talked about finally ran dry, replaced by weak, ineffective successors. Remember those land grants? Yeah, they completely backfired. Local officials became way too powerful, leading to deep feudalism. Trade dried up, cities declined, and eventually provincial governors just broke away to rule as independent kings. The center simply could no longer hold.
But, the fall of the empire was absolutely not the end of its story. Even though the political structure collapsed, the cultural and scientific achievements were already baked right into the DNA of the region. The Gupta legacy profoundly shaped classical Indian civilization, leaving behind foundational traditions in art, science, and religion that still endure around the world today.
So, the crucial point is, we are left with a massive historical paradox. On one hand, you have this soaring intellect, the invention of zero, calculating the Earth's rotation, literal masterpieces of art and literature. But on the other hand, you have increasing social rigidity, the decline of women's rights, and heavy taxation on the working class. Looking at all this historical evidence, how do you define a golden age? Does the sheer brilliance of the few outweigh the daily reality of the many? I'm going to leave that for you to decide. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll see you in the next